This happened 2 years ago, August 11th of 2018. And since the anniversary just passed, I thought I would finally share this story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about half an hour from where we live. For reference, my fiancé is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and racist area. This is important later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the exact same plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now, back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening, about 6 p.m., before heading back to our camp. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been inside of our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the ground, and my backpack had been rearranged and I was missing underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-old kids and decided that since whoever had busted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, that it was fine and they wouldn't come back. So we set up a campfire and set out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes, and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m. we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again, but this time we focused in. We heard clear footsteps and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around right outside. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Make that 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had telepathic abilities, my fiancé said, "I have to go to the bathroom," and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here is the part that I still get chills to think about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent when a man spoke directly to us from right outside. "What are you doing?" he asked. I can't even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Allow me to reiterate that we were stupid 19-year-old kids, so we decided to just make a run for it to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped outside. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell. I heard the footsteps running behind us, and then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We debated sleeping in the car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed up in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive to grab our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off of the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time. Stalking through the woods onto our campsite were 2 tall, white men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other one was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the other one stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest to follow roads, and called my dad so that he would know we were coming. When we got there, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us just being paranoid. So I never told anyone else besides all of you just now. I am convinced to this day that that was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the two men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to just make a run for it actually worked. So to those men who stalked our campsite with the hunting knives, let's not meet again. In 2017, my girlfriend and I moved into a tiny, kinda crappy house in our college town. The house was made by a couple of students a few years prior, so the architecture was a bit sloppy. For example, the roof was flat. Take note of this because it'll be important later. However, the house was really cheap and close to campus, so it seemed like a total steal. The first couple months living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but it wasn't too long before we began experiencing strange paranormal activities. The first odd occurrence was with our smoke detectors. Our smoke detectors would go off constantly. It was strange because they would go off even if there wasn't smoke in the house, from our bad cooking, for example. We thought that maybe it was because of old batteries, but no matter how many times we changed them, it never made a difference. It got to the point where they were going off 3 to 5 times a day, and at that, we just broke down and took the batteries out of them altogether. Note, there were 6 detectors in total. However, even without the batteries, the detectors were still going off. So out of desperation, we turned off the entire smoke detector circuit to the house. It was at this point when things started getting really out of control. The back room/storage room in the house always had a really eerie feeling, like someone was watching you or standing just behind you staring down at you. Thankfully, me and my girlfriend's bedroom was the furthest room in the house away from the storage area, so I avoided it like the plague. Anyways, one night around 3 a.m., the smoke detector in our bedroom goes off. However, it's not the usual repetitive beeping, it's a single, long beep. It sounded like when someone holds the test button on a detector. Frustrated, my girlfriend grabs a chair from the dining room and stands on it to reach the detector, but moments before she touches it, the beeping stops. We both groan in irritation as she goes to put the chair back, but before she makes it to the dining room, the detector down the hallway from our room makes the same continuous beep. Just like before, she stands on the chair to reach the detector, but right before grabbing it, it stops. Our smoke detectors continued this pattern all the way back to the creepy storage room. This happened 2 more times that night. It was as if whatever was messing with us was trying to lead us to its space. This would happen to us at least once or twice a week for the next 1.5 years that we lived there. Shortly after the encounters with the smoke detectors, the house became absolutely infested with bugs. There was no history of bug issues when we bought the home, and it started almost immediately after our first experience with the detectors. Bugs would pour out of light fixtures, small cracks in the walls, counters, and of course, the smoke detectors. Literally, one minute everything would be fine, and then the next, winged insects or ants would pour out of the walls. We had multiple exterminators come, but less than a week after treating the house, the bugs would be back, just as bad as before. It made us miserable, and I've never seen an infestation to that extreme. It was absolutely unnatural. After these events, we began feeling really terrified and depressed. We both hated being home, but there was no other place for us to go. This was when the footsteps started. Remember how I said our roof was flat? At least a few times a week we would hear large, heavy, possibly hoof-like footsteps on the roof. We tried writing it off as being animals, so whenever we heard the steps we would run outside to see if we could spot whatever the animal was. But there was never anything there. The steps were very far apart from one another. Whatever was walking on our roof would start from the creepy storage room and in maybe 3 or 4 steps walk to our bedroom. The steps were so loud that it sounded like whatever was haunting us was either very big or stomping to get our attention. Now began the phantom sounds. We had large metal bowls that we used for daily cooking, so when we were done we would wash them and set them on the counter to dry. The first time it happened, me and my girlfriend were sitting on the couch in the living room. The kitchen was right next to the living room, but there was an island that blocked our view to the sink area. Anyways, on this night we were startled by the sound of our multiple metal bowls being thrown off of the counter. At this time we didn't have pets, so we assumed the worst and thought that someone might be breaking into the house. We both shot up and ran over to face our worst fear, but not only was no one in the house, nothing in the kitchen had been moved. The bowls were still on the counter, just where we left them. This was the most common paranormal occurrence in the house, and it happened at least 5 to 10 times a day at all hours. After a while, we were so sick and tired of these disturbances that we stopped using our metal bowls, or if we did use them, we would hand dry them and put them away right after use. This didn't make the spirit very happy, so next, we started hearing what sounded like our ceramic plates being thrown to the ground, and our kitchen cabinets slamming over and over again. Do you know those types of cabinet hinges that close slowly? Yeah, that's what we had. So, to slam the cabinets like that, they would have had to have been closed with excessive force. The next phase in our haunting was sightings and photographs. The phone I had at the time had one of those automatic face tracking features, meaning that when you would take pics on my phone, the yellow boxes would appear around the person's face to focus on them. One night I was taking a picture in me and my girlfriend's bedroom when a yellow face tracker square appeared at the foot of our bed, way above our bed. If that was a person, they would have had to have been at least 7 feet tall. At the time, we did have posters on our bedroom walls, so while focusing on the face tracker square, I circled the room to confirm that the tracker wasn't just focusing on one of them by accident. To my dismay, no matter where I was in the room, or from what angle, the square stayed in the exact same place. Oh yeah, even better, I was home alone for a few nights. I don't think I've ever experienced such sheer terror as I did when I went to sleep that night. After this first encounter, having cameras track faces in our pictures became a constant occurrence all throughout the house. The final phase of our haunting before getting the heck out of there was physical encounters. This happened more often to my girlfriend than me, but something would occasionally grab and pull our hair, especially when we were walking through the living room. But the most terrifying experience goes to our friend Jamie. She came to visit us for a few nights, and while she was there, she would sleep on our couch. She was aware of all the paranormal encounters in the house, and she had seen most of them firsthand, but nothing compared to what was about to happen. It was around 3 a.m. when she woke up with an eerie, uncomfortable feeling. All of a sudden, she experienced what felt like someone or something stepping up onto the couch. It stepped both of its feet up, one on either side of her body. Starting from her feet, it slowly walked up the length of her body until it felt like 2 feet were on either side of her head. She said she felt an intense, malevolent energy staring down at her, but she was too terrified to open her eyes. Meanwhile, the cabinets in the kitchen began to slam over and over. For the next few hours, she pretended to be asleep all the while this presence was standing over her. She told me she's not exactly sure when it went away, because she eventually became so exhausted that she did fall back asleep. Not too long after this experience, we were finally able to sell the house and get the heck out. We lost tons of money because we sold it for way less than we had originally paid. I can't help but feel bad for the person who bought the home, but it's been almost 3 years and she's still living there. I think the takeaway from this story is if a house is priced too good to be true, then it is. I live in a forest outside of a large Croatian city. I consider myself lucky to live in a place so remote and peaceful, yet so close to civilization. It especially came as a blessing during the quarantine. That being said, living in this forest has its quirks that make you question how much of a heaven the place you call home actually is. I moved here around 5 years ago, but it was today that I finally discovered the dark truth about its past. I'd like to share what I found, but let's take it back first, to the day when I realized that there might be something more to this place than the human eye can perceive. It was a hot summer day a few years ago, and I was walking my dogs through the forest. I had recently discovered a new path that I had never walked before, as I didn't know how long it was and how much time that it would take to walk through. This time, though, I had the whole day for myself, so I finally gave in to my curiosity and ventured into the unexplored area. It seemed fairly normal, although it was way more quiet and seemed more isolated than the rest of the forest paths. The path was surrounded by steep valleys on both sides, which ended in deep wooded areas at the bottom, probably inhabited only by animals, or at least nothing human. I stopped for a moment to give my dogs water and take a short break. I was sitting on the ground while they drank, and I was enjoying the calming sounds of the forest, until the peaceful atmosphere was sharply interrupted by something downright disturbing. I heard a human voice shouting from the bottom of a valley. But not just any voice. It was my voice. And it was calling my name. I stayed there for a couple more moments, just to make sure that I was hearing it right, as it didn't make any sense. Sure enough, it was calling my name, again and again. I got up and ran home as fast as I could. Every step of the way I felt watched, and more paranoid, as if I were being chased. I did my research at home. I wanted to find an explanation as to what had happened to me. It fit the profile of a skinwalker. I don't feel entirely confident to conclude that that's what it actually was, though. As I already said in the beginning, I'm from Croatia, and I don't know enough about skinwalkers to know if they can be found here, if they even exist. Anyhow, that possibility didn't make me any more comfortable. Unfortunately, it wasn't a single event. This was only the beginning of strange happenings for me in that forest. I have a hard time falling asleep, so I usually go out for a nightly stroll up and down the street before I go to bed. My street is surrounded by forest, but it didn't used to scare me. I was used to the way the darkness looks, material in the trees, and I made peace with being exposed by the streetlights to anything that lurks within. After what I encountered, though, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, and the sound of leaves rustling as if someone were walking in there in the dark, every night that I take that walk. I will also sometimes hear my name being called from a distance, just like that summer day. I play it safe, so I casually stroll back into the house when it gets too intense, when I feel surrounded by invisible eyes preying on me, just waiting for the right moment. You have to play it cool. Don't let them know you know that they're there. Seem completely unbothered. Now, that skinwalker theory had stuck with me for a long time, even though I can't prove it. I feel like I was being stalked by one. That wasn't until today, when I found out about something I think I should have known a long time ago. I always knew my forest is an unusual place. Part of it is a memorial park, full of strange monuments. I thought those were just there for soldiers that died during the war, and didn't think much else of it. I'm currently in my 4th year of high school, and we're learning about the World Wars, so that sparked some curiosity to find out more about the forest. What I found left me in shock. Basically, horrible war crimes had taken place exactly there, and the ground is filled with mass graves of the executed and tortured soldiers. According to the official site of the Memorial Park's virtual museum, it is the quote-unquote site where the worst mass war crimes in the modern history of the city of Zagreb were committed. I was shocked, to say the least. Finding that information left me completely speechless. You'd think I had finally gotten my conclusion, an answer to what it is that haunts my forest. Instead, it just left me with even more questions. I don't know what entity spies on me, or what its intentions are. I don't even know if it's an individual, or if there's more of them working in unison against something that doesn't belong. The only thing I know for sure is the way it feels. In some way, my concerns seem justified. I most likely am not the only thing roaming these woods at night. The forest feels heavier now. The weight of the truth combined with the burden of worry leaves the night air tingling with tension. Oh, how the tables have turned. The presence I worry about the most right now is me. I might actually be the one disturbing the peace of things that were quietly buried in the soil. As much as I don't know their intentions, they also don't know about mine. I wish there was a way to make it clear that I approve of their ownership of these grounds, that I am okay with being merely a guest, privileged by their peace. So until further notice, I am the one haunting this place. This happened a few years ago while I was still in college. My best friend of many years is back in town, so we decided to get together and we stayed out fairly late, but hey, we're college kids, nighttime is our thing. My friend is very, very Catholic, and she decided to drive us this night. Mind you, neither of us was doing any drinking. After many shenanigans and lots of catching up, it was time to go home. It was probably around 2-3 a.m. Still not exhausted, but she definitely was. Well, I'm staring at her dash where one of her many Catholic baubles were in the car when we get to the last light before she drops me at my house. I look out the window, as one does, and was met with the person in the car next to us staring into the car, and I kid you not, I screamed. The guy had gray skin, black eyes with no white, and a smile that was too long with sharpened teeth. He didn't break eye contact with me, and I was freaking out. My friend was completely oblivious until I said her name. She somehow didn't hear me scream. I, as calmly as possible, told her to look at the guy in the car next to us, and then she silently screamed too. and then proceeded to freak out and gunned it out of the intersection. Once again, this was 3 a.m., the light was still red, and she was not having this. She sped to my house and had me watching behind the car to make sure that we weren't being followed, whilst praying aloud, something she never does as she knows that I'm not religious. A few very short moments later, she pulls up in front of my house. She also put her high beams on as I walked to my door because she was, again, not about this. After I was safely inside, she called my cell and had me on the phone until she made it to her house all of 3 minutes later. We were both really shaken up about it the next day, but we never talked about it again. Anytime I've tried to bring it up, she shudders and changes the topic immediately. She did tell me she went to be blessed the next day, on a random Tuesday. I can still feel the soul-shaking sensation of looking that guy in the eyes. I'm not saying it couldn't have been some dude dressed up in a costume or something, but it shook both of us to our core. It was a Monday night, at around 3 a.m, and I honestly don't feel like this was a normal human occurrence. My family has a camping timeshare, and we used to go there for weeks at a time in the summer. My dad had to work, so he would stay at home Monday through Thursday and come and meet us at the campgrounds Friday through Sunday. The campgrounds had a pool, a miniature golf course, basketball courts, and we'd gone for so long that my mom was comfortable letting us wander since there was only one entrance and exit. When I was around 8, but was fairly small for my age, so I looked around 5. I met a little boy who was camping with his single dad for a few days. He came to our campsite a lot, and knew we were staying for a while. I was pretty sad when he left, but his dad said they'd come back sometime soon. A few weeks later, his dad came back to the campsite right after my mom left to take a shower. He told me his son was coming later that week. He asked where my parents were, and I told him my dad doesn't come until Friday and that my mom always takes a shower at this time. He said bye and then left. The next day, he came by at the same time and told me that he had just found some kittens and asked if I wanted one. I said yes. He told me he kept them in his tent and that I could come pick one out. Now, this guy wasn't a stranger. My mom had met him when we picked his son up from our campsite, so I didn't get that creepy stranger vibe, and was okay going with him. We walked towards his campsite, but then he told me he had actually moved them to his truck so they wouldn't get too hot, which made sense to me at the time. He pointed to his truck right outside the gates of the entrance. I started walking toward the entrance with the guy when my dad pulls up. He got the day off work so he could spend more time with us. He asks what's going on, and I say, Tommy's dad said he has kittens in his truck and I can have one. My dad gets out of the car, tells me to run back to the campsite, so I do. When my dad gets back, he tells me to never go alone with an adult anywhere, even if I know them. I asked my mom years later about the whole thing, and she told me my dad kicked the crap out of him and called the cops. This is the story of the time I saw an apparition that looked as if it crept right off the silver screen. This encounter happened in the late summer, early fall of 2007. I was in the 4th grade and my family had just moved to the absolute boonies of Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi and still had a lot of family down there, but my father had been stationed in another state for the previous several years. Military. So I guess you could say we were moving back home. My parents were in the market to buy a house, but until they found one, we would be staying with my great-aunt and her family. My aunt had a beautiful but slightly run-down 100-and-something-year-old home in the woods on the outskirts of an abominably small town. In order to get to her home, you had to drive down a one-lane dirt road through the woods. On this particular afternoon, my sisters and my cousin, who was about our age, were playing tag in the front yard of my aunt's home. Now, you need to know a little bit about the layout of this yard. The yard was longer than it was wide. Picture a rectangle with the house on one end and the dirt roadway at the other end of it. If you're looking at the house from the road, the right side of the yard is bordered by muddy soil, thick trees, and bamboo that creates a sort of natural border to the property. On the other side of the yard is a length of tropical leafy bushes about waist high that run from the front of the porch almost down to the road separating the yard from the driveway, just on the other side of the plants. Near the road in the middle of the yard was a ginormous old oak tree dripping with Spanish moss. Now back to the game. This particular round of tag, I was it. My siblings and cousin were running around the yard and the house, trying to hide behind various things. As I was scanning the yard, I noticed the figure of a girl with long, straight brown hair, peeping her head out from behind the big oak tree. She was wearing a dress that fell below her knees, which was very different from what the rest of us kids were wearing, namely cut-off jean shorts and stained t-shirts. I thought it was odd to see someone there, since I could have sworn that I saw all of the girls run in the opposite direction toward the house, but I figured I would go and check it out anyway. As I made it to the tree, I looked behind the trunk, and there was no one there. I was beyond confused at this point. My 10-year-old brain didn't immediately jump to ghost. It was more along the lines of, who the heck was that? The tree was in the center of the yard, with no other trees or shrubbery within 20 or so yards, so if the girl would have run up from behind the tree, I should have seen her. By that point, I started scanning the yard, and my eyes happened to fall to those tropical bushes that bordered the driveway. Crouching down near the bushes was the same figure of the girl. I remember her squatting near the leaves and peering in my direction when I noticed that she had no face. She was completely absent of any facial features, eyes, lips, and nose. Her face was just a smooth expanse of flesh-colored skin. It looked like something straight out of Silent Hill. I must have looked away, and then she was gone. I have never seen this apparition since. Now, I honest to goodness recall this encounter just as I have described above, but it was also 14 years ago. It's quite possible that my memory is faltered in some aspects, or is exaggerated in others, but this is how I recall it. Either way, it was terrifying. This event happened to me last summer. It was probably the scariest story from my life, and I wanted to share it so hopefully someone learns from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person and love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever I get the chance. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you that I was an 18-year-old male at the time of this story, and have a decent-sized friend group both of boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane before departing for college. We all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And by some miracle, all of our parents thought that it would be fine. So we had 6 people along. Me, my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons that you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything that we needed to survive for those 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded enough, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not that close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy wooded area, but unfortunately there was no cell phone service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished with everything, Brandon and I took a look around the camp while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't very concerned because there was a house within a mile radius, and we assumed that it was those people that used this trail to hunt, which was big in that area, or that animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had our eyes on it at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a little bit, and called it an evening. The next day we decided to explore the woods a little bit, but Brandon and Kaylee decided to stay behind to watch the site and spend more time together. We decided to go down the path that we had found. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity. And no, not some voodoo or cult shit or anything like that, like flowers and notes that people left behind. And beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer and then head back because it was getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were about to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. Now this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful and we assumed the same about this night as we began to turn in. But boy were we wrong. You would assume that there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our site, but no, not at all. All of us woke to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. As we hear the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to his car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car while the other 2 tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone because before getting into his car, he yelled cemetery and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side. So I quickly grab Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running toward the trail. I use my phone flashlight to help see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had noped the fuck out of there and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily and I hop over the fence first. When we all get over the fence, we notice that Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone were climbing over the fence behind us. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled cemetery. We all stayed as still as we possibly could as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode. As the guy approached, I realized I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer, when he was right on top of me, I grabbed the knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran toward the car. As I stood, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had a look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched at the back of his knee. By his side laid a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve had floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove to the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there wasn't one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought us his hunting rifle with which to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there, there was nothing stolen, but all of our tents were slashed apart. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back, the officers were at their home, and we gave our statements. They said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way back. We were all processing what had just happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. College split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a year. My advice to all of you is please find a populated place to camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, please. Two years ago, I was hanging around with a group of mates in a small forest. Now, we've done this before more than once, and never really had anything weird happen except on two separate occasions. The first encounter that we had was a weird formation of stars slowly moving around in the sky in a triangle, and within a span of 2 seconds going incredibly fast and moving out of our view. All 7 of us saw this, so I know that it wasn't just my imagination. Now, the second encounter freaked us out the most. This happened at exactly the same location as where we saw the star formation. We were just casually hanging around in the midsummer, when around 2:30, out of the blue, I saw someone standing near us. I should point out that he was standing behind one of my friends, who I had just talked to about 3 seconds before. Everything about this guy struck me as off-putting. I should also point out that it was about 30 degrees Celsius at this time, but this guy was wearing clothes that you would wear in Siberia during the winter. He also wore sunglasses despite it being nighttime. The moment that I saw him, I instantly felt an intense sensation of dread. The others felt this as well. I asked him what he was doing here, and he just said, listening. After he said that, he moved a couple meters, but there was something really wrong with the way that he moved, as it looked like this guy glided over the ground. Because he got closer, I told him to stay back, and he just looked at me. In that moment, my fight or flight was kicking in hard, and I got the feeling that this guy was a genuine threat, so I got ready to defend myself if he attacked us. But just a second or two after, he looked at me again and just vanished. Like we were all looking at him, and one moment he was there, and the other, he was just gone. After our initial confusion, we decided that we should book it out of there, and we just ran as fast as possible out of the forest. Just a few notes. We didn't use any substances that could have influenced what we experienced. We didn't consume any drugs, alcohol, or anything else. We also remember quite well what happened that day. We're also well known in that forest, and because it's quite small, we have been everywhere in there, and never have we found any signs of homeless people, or anything like that. Before my best friends and I were separated, one passed away, the other moved away. We used to ride around doing all of the haunted legend places within reasonable driving distances. Sometimes we would drive for a few hours, but most of them weren't scary other than the adrenaline-filled, hyped up, "Did you hear or see that?" that would cause us to get spooked. This one was different. Way different. We were just out of high school, probably 20 at the most, and we were looking for an actually scary place to visit. A lot of people we knew that we were into these kinds of things, so we would always get tips on where to go. There was the original 3 of us that day, and another friend that wanted to tag along. After a little drive to our destination, about 45 minutes, we stopped at a Wawa to get gas and grab a few snacks. Like I stated earlier, we were all about 20 at the time, so we were all hyped up because we knew that spooky time was getting close. We'd always pick on that other friend that tagged along. Nothing harsh, but just, you're scared. So I believe it was me that said something along those lines that was overheard by a few people. It got the attention of other people in the Wawa, including these 2 creepy, older guys who seemed like they didn't fit in. Their clothes were all beat up and dirty, and they just didn't seem right for the area, and the time was probably 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. "What's the little one scared of?" asked one of them. I say little because the 3 of us are all abnormally tall. The shortest between us was 6'4", and he was normal, so probably about 5'9". We replied and explained how we got tipped to go to this road, because it's haunted. They replied that it wasn't scary, and if we wanted a real scare, we should go to this random road. I forget what it was called exactly, but apparently it's this random memorial statue for a plane crash in the middle of the woods, where crazy things are supposed to happen. We grabbed our stuff, didn't think anything of it. As soon as we left, the group started talking and decided to go with the other road that the guys had hyped up. I know. A typical horror movie what not to do. So we get to the entrance of the road, and already it did not disappoint. There were woods on both sides, not one street light in sight, and I remember there was this, detention center off to the right, in the middle of nowhere. So the spooks already began from the moment that we hit the entrance. We decided to drive down the road and search for the statue. We noticed that there were trees cut down on the side of the road and laying parallel to the shoulder of it. We finally find the statue. About 5 minutes go by in silence, and we decided to enhance the scare factor by shutting the lights off. About a minute goes by and we see a shadow figure pop up from the statue. We all freak out as it starts walking toward us, but it was making movements that no human would normally be capable of. It was dark out, but this thing was black. It was darker than the woodsy sky, so we could make out some of it. It was huge. Like I said earlier, we were all extremely large compared to the average guy, but this thing would have dwarfed any of us. We decided to peel out of there and continue down the road, figuring that it would lead us out. Boy, were we wrong. About 3 minutes go by, and we hit a dead end, which in this case was an open spot in the woods with sand everywhere. The cutout was massive, but surrounded by forest. There were different cutouts, and ways to go from there, and I'm pretty sure the road continued after this cutout, but we were pretty deep in the woods by that point. So we decided to turn around and leave, obviously. After we turn around, we stop to just take in the eerie feeling. The other 3 guys were talking about the shadow figure that we saw earlier, while I happened to catch something out of the corner of my eye. About 40 feet away from me, I see what appears to be a white face, and then another, and another, all surrounding the car. The other guys didn't see them, and I'm rarely ever scared, but seeing me panic, they all knew that something was up. My panic caused them to panic. We then floored it far away from the sand turnaround. We get about half a mile down the road, somewhat near the statue, and pull over to gather our composure before we get out of there. When we stopped, I swear I heard the most typical ghosty ooh kind of noise. This was now turning into a movie I wish that I was never part of. We were really scared. After finding the way that we had come, we started heading back out. Remember those trees I talked about earlier? They were now laying in the middle of the road, blocking us in, as we all see the white faces or masks that I had seen earlier. Thank God my one friend, the driver, was good at driving and valued safety over his car. We drove on the edge of the woods and felt like we were defying gravity to speed our way out. The car was literally sideways on the edge of the forest. I mean, I could literally stick a single finger out the window and touch the trees. We all made it home safely that night. After doing research, we found out that that spot was notorious in that area for crazy things happening, such as body dumps and murders. Because of the shadow and the ghost noise that we heard, my head, heart, and gut tells me that that place is actually haunted. As previously stated, that place is famous for dumping bodies, along with the plane crash, so there's bound to be some spirits there. I think where we were that night was actually haunted, but we just happened to be there on a night when there were more things going on. I can't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure that we survived one of their setups that night. I'm 100% sure that I will never go back again. The scariest thing that ever happened to me came from the person closest to me. My ex-husband and I were both only 19 when we married. When we first met, everything was glorious. I moved in with him and his family because me and mine were having a lot of trouble at the time, and for the first year, all was golden. Then one day, his stepdad went missing. The police found his body almost a week later, murdered. The tragedy tore through the three of them, Nikki, his mother, and sister, with an intensity similar to a massive hurricane. If Nikki's biological father had been present, that might have been one thing, but that piece of human excrement was not just absent, but only made the occasional appearance to steal one of the kids' social security checks from the mail on arrival, and that was usually when he knew no one would be home. When Fiona married Dave, he had become their father. The only father they ever really had. He was their true family. After the homicide, Nikki's whole personality shifted toward darkness. He would rant and rave like a man possessed, and become violent if I didn't do everything he told me to do, no matter what it was. To this day, I have scars from a physical altercation with his sister on being commanded to attack her and having no choice but to do so, for example. The scars make me who I am now, a survivor, but I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone. Being terrified for your life every single day and never knowing if any given moment could lead to your last is exhausting and traumatizing to say the least. One day we got into it so badly that I told him I wanted to divorce. He kicked me out of my own car at my parents' house and tore out of the driveway, spraying gravel everywhere and leaving puffs of dust floating up toward the sky. I was utterly distraught by the entire situation at that point, completely at my wit's end. Yet for some reason I still loved him, still wanted to make things work out, and for us to be together. So when he called and begged for the chance just to talk things over, of course I agreed, and went outside to anxiously await his return to pick me up. I expected him to have calmed down by the time he arrived. At least, that was what his tone had suggested over the phone. But when I got in the car, the whole vibe felt off. Chaotic. The tension was almost physically too much to handle. We rode in silence for about 5 minutes before he shot me a quick glare and then returned his attention to the road. His dark eyes drilled right through me, their anger giving off a certain glint like that of coal. "You know you're my wife, right?" he asked in a syrupy, sickly sweet voice. "That means you belong to me." I didn't really know how to respond, so I said nothing. My mind turned 1,000 miles an hour, deciphering what he was telling me, though. His level of possessiveness over me had steadily increased in the past 6 months or so after Dave's death, as if he were terrified of me disappearing along with the glue that had held together his tiny little broken family. My subconscious screamed at me that the whole thing had been a ruse, a trick to lure me back into the car. I looked down at my hands in my lap, wringing them together until my knuckles turned red. "I thought you wanted to fix things," I said. He smirked, and my gut went cold. My worst fears confirmed in that twisted, psychotic expression of his. "What do you think this is?" he replied. "It feels like a trick," I told him. He pursed his lips together, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. His shoulders tensed, and his expression grew more malvoyant than ever. "That's because it was a trick," he murmured. "If I can't have you, no one can." Until the moment he said those words aloud, I always thought of that expression as one of those you only ever hear or read in fiction. It never occurred to me that there was a reason that it existed. Someone, or many others most likely, who had heard the phrase and felt the sheer horror that accompanied its implication. In the course of our relationship, I endured punches, kicks, 2 totaled cars, and multiple death threats. A couple of weeks after this incident, I finally managed to get away from him for good. I stayed the night at a friend's house after getting what little things I needed. She lived not far from his grandparents, but I didn't really think anything of it because the neighborhood is one of those upscale, quiet, safe kind of suburbs. We partied most of the night. She went upstairs to sleep around 1 and left me on the couch in the living room watching TV, willing myself to pass out. About an hour later, around 2 a.m., I felt like someone was watching me. I looked over at the sliding doors to my left that led out into the backyard, and there he was. He was standing outside, in the dark, in the rain, watching me and crying with his fists clenched. I felt my eyes grow wide, and I sank slowly down into the leather cushions as if they could make me disappear from sight. I don't know how much longer he was there. When I looked again, he was gone. The next day, my mom came to get me, because he wrecked my car, so I no longer had a ride. He was standing at the corner staring at her as she drove past. We had to get a police escort to take us straight to the station to get a restraining order. I spent the next year getting the divorce straightened out and getting the rest of my belongings that he was trying to hold hostage, like my birth certificate, diploma, and social security card. I spent the next 6 years, even after entering into a wonderful and truly loving relationship, in fear that he would come for me. Even now, 8 years later, sometimes he will still try to contact me through other people or fake accounts on social media. Sometimes the most unsuspecting person is the one you have to worry about. Sometimes all it takes is one tragedy to twist a person completely inside and turn them into a monster on the outside. My mom had always told me that I was gifted. I could always feel energies, I had dreams of things that would come to happen. I wouldn't say I'm a medium or anything like that. I've never communicated with spirits. More so, I'd say I attract them. We hopped apartments a lot when I was younger, and no matter where we went, an entity would immediately find me. I'd have recurring nightmares, see figures, be scratched, etc. You could say spirits like to pick on me. Another random fact that will come into play later. I had bright blue eyes, like my mother. We moved into this apartment, and things immediately went very, very poorly. I had a dream that only lasted seconds. I was in a bright white room, and there was this beast on the ceiling, and it looked into my eyes and roared. It was so incredibly loud. I woke up, and my mom and her boyfriend at the time had rushed to my aid because they heard me let out a scream that sounded like a deep, full-grown man's scream, not a prepubescent boy's. My eyes turned hazel with brown splotches, and have been that way ever since. I was terrified. We moved me into my big brother's room. That night, I felt a presence, opened my eyes, and I saw a shadowy figure reach out and try to grab me. I sprinted out of the room and slept next to my mom or on the couch in the living room from then on, but I always felt watched from the hallway leading to my bedroom. Another thing that happened was when I was laying in bed with my mom and her boyfriend, she looked up and saw a little girl in a petticoat standing in the hallway. He saw it too. I was asleep, and only knew this because they told me years later. Anyhow, everyone was being terrorized for months, and eventually we had enough. We hired someone to come in, and she immediately detected a demonic presence. She had informed us that the building used to be a medical waste facility. They'd dispose of and store blood in the basement. That sort of thing. My mom has told me since that she was able to confirm this detail, but to be truthful, I never asked how. Thinking about and speaking about this incident brings me terrible feelings. Anyhow, she blessed the place, and it didn't really do anything. We tried writing scripture on the walls and this sort of highlighter stuff that you could only see in UV light. We put up some crosses, that sort of thing. It only served to make whatever it was angrier. We eventually moved out, and my mom spoke clearly as we left. "We're leaving. You are not allowed to follow us." I've never had another experience with a spirit. A friend of mine who says that she is a medium, I'm not sure what I believe about this sort of thing, told me that maybe God, maybe a spirit, maybe myself, walled myself off spiritually from my gift. I think that maybe it was the same spirit tormenting me my entire life up until that point. When I think about this, tears immediately begin pouring from my eyes. I'm 20 now, and this was easily one of the most turbulent times of my life. So this actually happened at the beginning of June, and after some meetings with the cops, I've decided to share it here. It's been a small tradition for me to go quote-unquote camping in my backyard every summer for a few weeks or so. Our yard is 6 acres, and part of it is a small wooded area next to our pond. You can't see the road directly, but you can see the cars passing by if you look well enough. Anyways, since it was a nice area, I set up a small 2-person tent, and the first few nights went really well. A few mosquito bites here and there, but apart from the bugs at the pond, there was nothing too bad. It was the 6th night when it happened. That night I wanted to stay up late and make a small fire in the fire pit to roast marshmallows and all that, simply because I could. I did it all, and now it was 2 a.m. I was walking back to the hill to get up to the wooded area when I looked out over the pond and saw a figure just standing there. I couldn't tell if it was actually looking at me or not, and honestly thought that it was just one of our small pine trees next to the road. Looking around, there was a car parked on the side of the road, turned off. The moonlight helped me see the car's silhouette. At first, I shrugged it off a bit, trying to think rationally about it, because I wanted to go to bed. I called out. No answer. I turned to my side and decided it was all too scary for me, and wanted to sleep inside tonight. But then I saw the figure start to move as well. I put two and two together, and then ran towards my house and right into it, and locked the back door. It was left unlocked in case I needed to go in. This person was just halfway across the backyard when I locked the door. They were hella fast to get around that pond so quickly. I ran and woke up my parents. My dad got his loaded handgun that he kept in the small safe on his nightstand. I called the police, and my mom went to check on my other siblings upstairs. My dad went out to look for the man, and I stayed on the porch, watching him go off into the yard. By that point, I couldn't see the man, or see far enough to know if the car was still there or not. My dad was shouting a lot, and I couldn't see him very well when he got to the edge of the forest. He was coming back when I saw the car's headlights turn on, and it skidded away with squealing tires. When the cops arrived, he was long gone, and the most description that I could give was a man about 6 foot tall and fast. The next week went by with some investigations around our property, and quite frankly, with lack of description or evidence, much more than some tire tracks, I'm assuming they haven't found anyone. They said they would call me if they did, but at this point, I really don't think they will. My dad is now thinking of putting up some fence along the back road, and I've been staying inside most of the time. So, creepy man in our backyard, let's not meet again. In 2017, I was in Northern Ireland for a college field trip. My religious studies class was visiting stone circles to focus on religious geography. On this particular day, it was normal, cloudy, and we were enjoying learning the history of the Bronze Age of Wonder, excitedly waiting to go back to the hotel to begin a new day of pub hopping. I remember the stone circles being separated from the nearby woods with a small wire fence. For some reason we were hanging around the fence, peering at the woods that lay not 20 yards away. We had yet to go into any woods during our trip, staying mainly at the sites surrounded by farmland. I remember wanting very much to go into this old forest for whatever reason. We all seemed to feel curious about it. I decided to climb over the small farm wire fence and see if there was anything interesting in the woods. These woods were different from the woods that I was used to in North America. The branches were thick, too thick to stand in. I had to bend at the waist to traverse them. The ground was covered in a soft, light brown moss broken up by tree roots. I remember quickly moving under the branches, staring at the ground as to not trip. I felt giddy like I was a child going somewhere my parents told me not to. I felt light, and I began to pick up speed. I suddenly looked up to make sure that I wasn't about to run into a tree trunk when something made me stop in my tracks. I saw legs. Human legs. I could only see their legs, like someone was standing straight up in the trees. The branches again were too thick to stand in, but this person's legs were the only thing visible. I felt an almost animal response of fear that didn't really make any sense. I told myself that they couldn't see me because I couldn't see their face, but for some reason I felt that they knew I was there. Why would someone be out here? We were the only group at the circles, and there were no houses nearby. I looked behind me and realized that I was much farther into the woods than I had thought. I could barely see the light from the place where I had originally entered. It was so quiet. They had to have heard me approach. My only thought was, I'm closer to them than I am to the entrance. They could get me before I make it out. I was only standing there, bent over for no more than a minute, but it felt like forever. I didn't see them move, but I could tell that they were facing toward me, not away. I now really felt like I was somewhere that I wasn't supposed to be, only this time instead of giddiness, I felt nauseous. As if I were a deer and they a hunter, I turned and bolted. I flew through those trees, still bent to avoid collision. I didn't look down this time, stumbling as fast as I could, only focused on the light at the end of the trees. I felt the branches pull at my hair and clothing as I ran. I couldn't hear anything over my own breathing. As soon as I broke the tree line, I felt a weight lift. The group standing at the fence looked startled by me bursting out of the forest. I told them that I thought I had seen someone, but it almost felt wrong to talk about it. We left soon after. I have no idea what it was. Was it a person hanging out deep in the forest? Was it a fae, a spirit, the green man? All I know is that it felt otherworldly. Disclaimer. I am completely aware that this story involves me being very stupid and careless. I'm not going to inject these acknowledgments into the story, but rest assured that in hindsight, I am aware of the foolishness that took place. Now, where to begin? The year was approximately 1998 or 1999. I was a young gay man in my early 20s, living in a medium-sized city in the Midwestern U.S. This was sort of an in-between transitional time for gay people, where in most populous areas we had enough respect to live openly, but there was still plenty of people who did not like us. It was well before the invention of smartphones, and the internet was still in the early stages of mass adoption. There were large communities online, but it was not yet at that point where most Americans were online. Online socialization consisted of chat rooms hosted by various services like AOL, Yahoo, or IRC servers, and message boards were still in use by large numbers of people. For gay men at the time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Prior to the internet and to the broader cultural changes, gay men had been stuck looking for fun in secretive and/or shady places due to the inability to freely express ourselves. In the 90s, it was still somewhat risky, but the internet offered a way to talk freely and relatively anonymously without the risk of being outed or worse. For this reason, it really took off in the gay communities, and gay men were a very large part of the user bases for these social platforms. It was suddenly very easy and relatively safe to find dates, friends, or just sex, and it quickly became the norm for a lot of gay men. On the other hand, being such a new tool for most people for communication, we were sometimes blind to the risks. Being an attractive young man in my prime, I made liberal use of the online communities to find dates. That is to say, I had plenty of hookups. My city had a decent number of chat rooms and personal message boards, and I had mostly great experiences. I met the typical assortment of good guys, closet cases, and the weirdos that you would expect. I was an absolute quote-unquote hoe by most standards, but suffice to say that a cute gay guy at that time could generally have a lot more dates than your typical straight person. At some point during this time, I had some brief chat on a message board with a guy from my city. I forgot his screen name, it's been over 20 years, so let's call him Slim Guy 65. This back and forth had happened on a general thread in the gay section, not in private messages, so it was visible to anyone who chose to read that thread. Nothing had come of it, but a week later, I received an email from an unrecognized address. The email basically said, "Hey, I'm not gay and I don't agree with the gay lifestyle. I'm here because my friend met this guy, Slim Guy 65, from the message board, and the guy really hurt him. I don't want to see this happen to anyone else. My friend tried to tell the police, but they wouldn't do anything. I see you're talking to Slim Guy 65, so just be careful and stay away from him. Okay, I thought, that's strange. What does this person mean by really hurt him? Was his heart broken? Did he get beaten up or verbally abused, or what? I responded to the email, asking for clarification on what exactly had happened. I never received a response. I was slightly weirded out by it, but on the other hand, it's an anonymous email from someone who doesn't respond and is vague about their warning. This could be anything. It could be some disgruntled ex trying to mess with the guy. It could be a real warning about some gay bashing. It could be someone trolling who doesn't have anything to do with anyone. I kept it in the back of my mind, but pretty much shrugged it off. Several weeks later, I had a weekday off of work and decided to take to the internet, as was my custom. Lo and behold, I had an email response to a personal ad. It was Slim Guy 65. He was offering to meet at his place to hang out and just have a good time. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I won't go into the details. As I recall, there weren't really many details discussed other than small talk and intros that we had done previously. Nothing about this guy was really sounding interesting to me, but I had no other offers on this day, so I decided why not. I'll go see what this dude is about. As I typed my reply, I suddenly remembered the strange email that I had received warning me about this person. I went back and reread it. Still vague, still presenting more questions than answers. Should I take this anonymous warning at face value and just ignore SG65? I decided to go check him out anyway. His address was on a rather busy street in the middle of a dense residential area, not some shack out in the woods, and I can handle myself. If he's weird, I can just nope out of there. Before long, I arrived at the house at the agreed time. It was a duplex-style home, with one apartment on the ground floor and one on the second floor, part of a row of several identical duplexes. It was the middle of the afternoon, there was plenty of traffic on the street, and the occasional person out on their porch or their backyard. I pulled up the driveway to the parking area behind the house, got out, and knocked on the door. The guy that answered was a pretty normal, kind of mousy-looking man, probably in his 40s. Slight, slim build, soft-spoken, looked like just about any guy working in any office cubicle anywhere. Not really my type, but honestly, my curiosity was piqued, and I had nothing better to do, so I stepped inside to take a look around and gauge the situation with the warning email fresh in my mind. I stepped into the back door, into the kitchen. It was very clean, and there was nothing out on the counters, no table, no chairs, nothing. That is to say, it did not look like someone was living there. It had been kept up and cleaned, but was empty. Looking out into the apartment, I could see that it was not set up as a living space. It had a large window with sliding glass that was between the kitchen and living room, and I could see what looked like a large table out in the living room area. SG65 said something like, "This isn't where I live. A friend of mine used to run a doctor's office here, and I maintain the building for him. It's private, though. We have the place to ourselves." Weird. Okay. He shut the back door and locked it with a keypad deadbolt. The kind you need a key to open, even from the inside, and put his keys in his back pocket, saying, "So what do you want to do?" At this point, my danger sense spiked. This is not a normal home, and why is he locking the door like that? It's not necessarily suspect. A lot of people have that sort of lock on their door, and the door has a window in it, so it makes sense even. Still, something is not right here, I can tell, and now I'm locked in. I asked him why he was locking the door like that, which immediately flustered him. He was looking around rather nervously, and his voice was wavery and halting. Not quite stuttering, but almost. He said, well, we don't want someone to come in and interrupt us, right?" Flashing a weak, unconvincing smile. His demeanor and body language were all I needed to confirm that this guy was up to no good, or at least that there was something he was hiding. However, I could tell that I was intimidating him. I wasn't a particularly muscular kid, but I have a larger frame. Like, even when I'm at my thinnest, I still wear size L tops and 36 waist pants, so I look big, which people tend to interpret as me being stronger than I really am. Also, I'm not a tough guy at all, but I have a resting facial expression that makes me look like a thug. People who don't know me often assume that I'm rough or something. I sometimes use this to my advantage while I can, because before long a new acquaintance will eventually figure out that I'm a total wimp. But this was definitely an occasion to play up the tough guy appearance, and I did exactly that. I put on my best steely face and told him to unlock the door, and that I don't want to be locked in here. He looked for a moment like he was going to pee his pants, then said, "Okay, alright, I'll unlock this." He unlocked the deadbolt. "And I'll just lock the knob here." And he turned the little dial that locks the doorknob. That was fine with me. I continued to stare at him until he said, "I'll leave the keys on the counter right here," and he set his keys down near the sink. I was relatively satisfied with that answer. At this point, though, my adrenaline was flowing, and I was almost in full flight or fight mode. But I was stuck, kind of stuck in place. The guy was between me and the door. I was freaked out, but this little weasel did not appear to pose any immediate physical threat to me. I could tell that his pant pockets were empty, and that I was intimidating the living hell out of him. I didn't yet know exactly what to do. Now keep in mind that despite my wordy descriptions, this all happened very quickly without any really long pauses. It had only been maybe 1 to 2 minutes since I had stepped in the door. This all happened at the pace of a conversation. The guy was obviously nervous and trying not to appear so. He said, "Well, let's go in," and walked a wide path around me through the kitchen into what would normally be the living room, and toward the hall to the right from there. I was familiar with his floor layout. It's very common in the area. The hallway would lead to 2 small bedrooms, with a bathroom in between them. I hesitated, thinking that I should just walk out that back door and take off. But really, now I was super curious. I knew there's no way in hell I'm doing anything with this guy, but I kinda want to see what's going on in here. Also, I'm confident that he can't take me if it comes to a fight. So, I slowly headed toward the living room. It felt like I was walking in slow motion. From the kitchen entrance, I could see a large, rectangular, stainless steel table taking up a lot of the living space. I remember thinking this looked like a surgical table. It looked like it could rise and tilt, and it had a recessed channel running all the way around the edge. In hindsight, I now know what it was. It was 100% a mortician's table. Dude had a mortician's table in there. But at the time, I just thought it looked like some sort of medical table. There were some other office-type cabinets and stuff around, I think, but now all I really remember is the table itself. The large front window looking out onto the street was covered by vertical blinds that were closed. SG-65 said something like, "This used to be a doctor's office, like I said. Come on back here." The hallway revealed the room setup that I had expected. The first bedroom door was closed. The second door was open to a very small, very clean bathroom. At the end of the hall was the other bedroom, which looked like, if the doctor's office story were true, had at one time been converted to an exam room. He said, "We can go in that room if you want. Go ahead and take a look." And he stayed by the other closed bedroom door. The back bedroom door was open, and I could see the walls were covered in a honey-colored wood paneling, the type you might see in a den or office that hasn't been updated since the early 70s. I slowly took a few steps toward that door, trying to be very aware of what Mr. Creepy was doing behind me. He didn't move. When I got up to that room, the first thing I noticed was the door had a keypad deadbolt lock, just like the back door. This room locked from the outside. I wondered if there was a lever on the inside, but I pretty much know the answer to that question without needing to check. I also saw a chair. A non-swiveling, plastic desk chair with thin metal legs sitting near the center of the room. The room had old, dark carpet and those wood-paneled walls. I noticed that the walls were completely paneled with no windows. And I know that room had at least one window, probably two, so whoever did that paneling went over them on purpose. There was also a phone in there, plugged in, and sitting on the floor. It was an old office phone, probably from around the 80s or early 90s, dingy beige plastic with several buttons to manage different phone lines. It was just sitting there on the carpet near the wall, with the chair at a slight distance facing the phone. There was nothing else in that room. I was standing at the threshold of the room, with one foot slightly in, absolutely not going past that door frame. I looked back at Dude. He was still standing by the other door, just nervously smiling at me, trying very hard to look casual, but obviously very nervous or something. He said something like, "Well, what do you want to do?" Instead of answering, I felt around the back side of the deadbolt lock. Sure enough, nothing there but the smooth wood of the door. It also dawned on me that I did not see a light switch anywhere for the ceiling lamp. Where was the switch? Who knows? It should have just been on the inside of the door, of course, but that original switch was covered by the paneling. He mumbled something about not having the key to that lock. Don't worry about it. I turned back to face the guy and just said, "What is it that you want to do in here?" My skin had gone ice cold as I realized that I was way, way, way too far into this apartment. I was running through my options in my head. What was this guy going to do? He didn't appear to have any weapon or anything in reach, but who the hell knows what goes on in that place? What are you trying to do? He was almost totally derailed by that. He stammered out, "Some hot man-to-man fun?" With the weakest smile that I have ever seen, looking like he was just a hair's breadth away from panicking. That sounds comical, but really, that sentence was probably the most chilling part of the entire experience for me. It was the way he said it. Like he had to come up with something on the fly, something that would sound plausible, and he failed. Who says that in real life? "Hey, do you want to have some hot man-to-man fun?" Nobody. It's something you'd see on an advertisement for a cheesy porn site or something. That was it. I said, "Nope, I want to go, I'm leaving." He said, okay. I quickly walked past him as he flattened himself against the wall to avoid me, and I noped right out through the living room dissection area and through the kitchen to the back door, which was thankfully still not deadbolted. The keys were still on the counter. I let myself out and didn't bother closing that as I saw him slowly coming to the door behind me. I deliberately walked, not ran, to my car. Looking back at the building, I could see that indeed there was a window facing the backyard area from that paneled room, but of course it was covered up from the inside. Dude was shutting and locking the back door, and I left, heart pounding, skin icy cold, thinking, holy crap, what was that? So, was this guy some sort of killer? Or was he just an awkward, closeted gay guy with access to a sterile-looking apartment with an autopsy/mortuary table and a windowless room that locks from the outside, with a chair and a phone and no light switch? It's clear to me that the poor soul who walks into that room gets locked in. He probably shuts off the light from somewhere and calls the phone. Other than that, it's anyone's guess as to what actually happens. I assume the friend of the judgmental person who emailed me must have been some kid that got locked in for whatever game ensues. Driving home, at first I thought, of course I have to call the police and tell them what's in that place. But thinking it through, I realized that I didn't really have any crime to tell them about. I went to meet a man for casual sex, and what? He has a room with a chair in it? He has, as I thought at the time, an exam table? The police aren't going to do anything with that story. The guy didn't touch me or do anything to me, and I left. I considered calling an anonymous tip line, but again, what exactly would I report? There was no actionable crime. Also, keep in mind that at that time, while the local police in the city were pretty decent, they weren't especially interested in getting involved with helping out the gays. They would prosecute actual crimes if it was cut and dry, but I heard plenty of accounts of them not choosing to follow up on cases where there was not an easy arrest to be made. I decided not to report anything because nothing would come of it except drawing unwanted attention to myself. Even in retrospect, I think that was probably the most rational choice to make. If this happened today in 2020, the law enforcement would probably be a lot more interested in it. But back then, not so much. So, live and learn. I still drove past that house once in a while during the normal course of life over the next several years, and I'd pay attention to how it looked. The vertical blinds were closed for maybe 5 or 6 years whenever I went past. Then, eventually, the blinds were down, and there were decorative curtains in the windows, so I assumed that the place was eventually sold to someone who actually lived in it. Around 2002, maybe 2003, there was the murder of a young man on the news. He had been found in the next state, which borders on my city, so it's not very far away. I recognized the guy from the gay community, but didn't know him personally. A friend mentioned to me something about the local serial killer. I said, "What?" He explained that a few young men had gone missing over the past year, each after being at one specific dive bar, and each being found several miles to the north past the state line, and out in the country. The case on the news matched with that MO. My friend told me that the young guy had been at that bar and left with someone that night, and that he had disappeared. The news report didn't mention anything about a gay bar or similar recent cases, of course. I had to wonder if my acquaintance from the internet had anything to do with it. The location of the murders apparently was nowhere near that duplex, or at least according to the story I was told. I never heard of a resolution to that murder on the news, or any official mention of a suspected serial killer other than gossip. I have not been able to stop thinking about this experience since it happened about 10 years ago. I have never felt anything like it. Myself and 2 friends went for a walk in our local forest. I tend to walk fast, so I had walked on ahead of them. I got to a certain part of the forest, and literally from nowhere, I was struck with the most overwhelming feeling of terror. It was so strong that it literally stopped me mid-stride. I froze and could not move. I was petrified. There was nothing and nobody else around. Then I get what can only be described as a certainty in my head. It couldn't be accurate to call it a voice, rather an overwhelmingly strong sense of knowing that I needed to look to my left. I did so. There was still no one and nothing there, except for a big crack in the side of the rock face that basically made for a small cave. Whatever it was, I knew that it was in that cave, but physically there was nothing to be seen. I am not easily freaked out. I cannot impress on you enough how utterly terrified that I was in that moment. And this was the middle of the afternoon. Had the next part not happened, I could have dismissed this and thought little of it. But it did happen. As I stood there unable to move, one of my friends walks nonchalantly around the corner and immediately, without me even having a chance to look at her try to move, she stops dead in her tracks and says, "Whoa, bad energy off that cave." I try to stumble out some explanation of how I am feeling, but I can't. My brain was literally scrambled by fear. A minute later, our male friend appears. Both of us women start trying to explain to him what was happening, because he felt nothing. He approached the cave to look in, and we 2 grown-ass women are begging him not to get too close to it. I was actually on the verge of tears. But again, he felt absolutely nothing. He took a long look inside and reckoned that we were both just being a bit hysterical. It was the weirdest thing. Whatever was in there was just gone in an instant the second that he appeared. I've always had an uncanny knowing that whatever it was did not intend to harm us. It just wanted us to know that we needed to walk the F away from that area, and that it was willing to harm us if it needed to. Oddly, I have such a clear image in my head of the spot where this happened, and I know that forest like the back of my hand. Over the past 10 years, I have looked for that cave and that rock face many times. I have never been able to find it again. So I don't know how many people really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, or in people who say that they can see them. I would never say that I'm some professional psychic or medium. I'm not. I just know that I've always been able to see things that other people couldn't, hear things other people couldn't, and knew things that other people didn't. Pretty much my whole life. I felt like a freak and a weirdo for a long time until I just realized this is happening and it isn't going away, so I needed to accept it. I got help from professional mediums and the woo-woo community, and it helped. Backstory, but important. I was laying in bed in my room a couple years ago, trying to fall asleep. It was a long hallway, and my sister's room was at the end, and so was my mom's. My sister had a friend over who was dealing with an abusive boyfriend, and they were drinking and talking about it. This will also be important. You know how you get that feeling that someone's watching you? Or that feeling in a store when you just know that someone has stepped into your space? You don't have to look, you just know. That's what I felt. I looked up, and there's some girl with just her head poked into my room sideways. I just saw her head sideways leaning past my door frame. She looked shorter, maybe 20s, with long black hair, kind of like the girl from The Ring. I'm looking at her wondering what she wanted, and she started to smile. Slowly, her eyes got huge and black, and her jaw unhinged into this giant, sick, pitch-black grin. Ice cold slammed into the pit of my stomach as I just stared at her for what felt like hours, frozen in fear before what I'd been taught kicked in, and I made her leave. She instantly turned back to normal and skipped off down my hallway toward my sister's room. I thought, oh, is it my sister's friend? Depression and abuse and all those bad situations can really attract those types of beings, so I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward to literally last night. It's been years. My parents got divorced, which is a whole other post of creepy shit. I realized it wasn't just my dad who was the narcissist. It's absolutely my mom, too. They were a toxic pair, and currently, I'm in a situation where I have to live with my mom. It's fine, it's free. I'll be grateful and deal with it. Last night, I'm laying in my bed watching TV, minding my own business. Suddenly, I feel that feeling again. It's always the same feeling regardless of what type of ghosty it is. For me, anyways. I look at my door, and it's the exact same girl. I asked her what she was doing here, and she didn't respond. She just started smiling. Only this time her eyes went white, and her mouth grew into the same huge black grin, but she had tons of teeth like a shark. I get up to get my incense, which drives them out, and she runs in the direction of my mom's room. I go out into the hallway to look in that direction, and I see through my mom's cracked door this weird demon girl literally sitting crouched on top of my mom, staring at me. Almost like she was an animal claiming her prey. It was wild. I've never ever seen anything like that before. I also realized that this girl was never with my sister's friend. She was with my mom for however many years. But my mom's a crazy and very, very negative person regardless of what anyone does to help her. She loves drama and loves being a victim and loves complaining, so it's matching her energy, I guess. This ghost girl feels more like a bully than anything truly demonic. Like she had fun picking on people, which my mom absolutely does too. This ghost girl can't hurt me. She's just around, and man, it sure is scary when she is. She looks like an absolute demon, that's for sure. I've since seen other types of entities in her room at night while she slept, and have told her about it. She says I'm crazy at first, and then in the days that follow, she'll tell me how it feels dark. About 3 years ago, I went camping with my now ex-girlfriend. She had always expressed interest, but had never actually been. The spot we went to is in the Huron National Forest, and is my go-to trail camping spot, as it's hidden deep in the forest, and the access trail is close and easy to get to, for ATVs, etc. My family has been going to this spot for about 6 years, and my friends that introduced me about 10 or so years. We went for a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well, except we did notice a group of people that were hanging out next to our campsite, but they were just stargazing, and soon they left. Then around midnight is when the weird stuff started to happen. At first it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but the laugh never ended, and got very high-pitched as it just kept going. After a while, we both got kind of scared and went into the tent to try and sleep, and that's when the laughter/noise moved up higher, and then started to circle the campsite. After a while of that happening, it just suddenly stopped, and then started again around 3 a.m. When it started again, the fire was going out, so I went to stoke it with my shotgun in hand, and turned on my flashlight to see if maybe I could see any coyotes or something around the campsite, but I didn't see anything or hear any movement. This went on until 6 a.m. and then stopped, and then finally we were able to get some rest. After we woke up, we checked around the camp and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I tried to start my vehicle, and it was completely dead. That really freaked me out, as I'm always paranoid about leaving things plugged in that kill the battery and make sure that everything was closed. Yet somehow, the battery still died. I was able to get a jump from AAA. After that happened, I told my friend, who had shown me the campsite and also has a cabin in the same forest, roughly 25 miles away from that particular campsite, about what happened, and he got freaked out. He told me about 2 incidents. One at the campsite, and one at his cabin. At the campsite, he stated that one night after we had all returned from trail riding and went to bed, he stayed up to hang out by the fire and have a few drinks. While he was hanging out, he was just looking off into the distance, and saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as being bioluminescent. He flashed his high-powered flashlight at them, but there was nothing there. And as soon as the flashlight turned off, there they were again, looking right back at him. So he packed up and went right to bed. He didn't tell us because he didn't want to scare us. At the cabin, he was hanging out with his brother, and they were both just chilling by the fire outside, when again they saw a pair of eyes looking at them from a trail that leads into the woods. They stated that at the height the eyes were looking at them from, whatever it was, had to be 7 foot plus tall. They started shooting at it with their rifles, and the eyes disappeared, but once they were gone, they reappeared and were closer. At that point, they were both freaked out and got back into the cabin and did not leave until daylight. We have no idea what this could have been, but all felt very scared when these events were happening. After we talked about it, one of the brothers thinks it's a Wendigo. I don't really know what that could be, but I haven't been that terrified since. This happened around the end of November of last year, while I was at a late-night party at a mutual friend's house. The night started off fine, with us having a few drinks and talking about the classes that we would be taking next semester. This pretty much went on till around 2 a.m., and by this time I wanted to go home since the party was already dying down and most of my friends had already left and I was practically there alone. Instead of wasting money on an Uber, I decided to walk home since my neighborhood was only a few blocks away, but it was still a decent walk. However, there was a shortcut. There was a secluded dirt road in the neighborhood which led to a stretch of walkway with an irrigation canal for crops, and it happened to lead straight to the backyard of my house. I began making my way to the lonely dirt road, and I started to second-guess my decisions since that stretch of walkway can be pretty shady, especially at night since a few drug dealers and junkies like to hang out there. I mustered up the little courage I had, feeling confident that I'd be able to handle myself if anything ever hit the fan, so I proceeded to walk on the desolate road. The night sky was well lit. The moon illuminated my surroundings enough for me to see my environment pretty clearly. The walk was actually pleasant. The only thing that made it tough to navigate was the overgrown, thorny weeds and mesquite branches that kept scraping against the exposed parts of my skin. As I continued to walk through the brush, I finally got to the clearing that led to the bridge, and to my relief, there didn't seem to be anyone in sight. As I began to cross the bridge, I then picked up a faint scent of lavender mixed with something rancid, like the smell of a good cheese or days-old roadkill. I couldn't even tell where it was coming from, but as soon as I made it to the other side of the bridge, the environment seemed to suddenly shift. It's hard to describe, but there was this heavy pressure that washed over me, like being submerged underwater, coupled with this gut feeling telling me that something about the environment was just off. I pushed the feeling off as a random anxiety attack, since I do get them sometimes, but deep down I knew this was different. To calm my nerves, I stopped walking and did slow breathing and began to count to 10 while clenching and releasing my fist to try and shake off this bad vibe or whatever it was. When I finished my little ritual, I felt a little better and more at ease. I started to walk in the direction of my house until I heard this odd grunting sound come from behind me. I turned around, and I saw a woman with short black hair and a silky white gown crouched down with her back turned away from me. She was just a few feet away, and it was strange because when I crossed the bridge, I didn't see anyone around the area. Did I pass by her without even realizing it? I thought to myself. She was hunched over, after all, and I do tend to get caught up in my own little world. At this point, the faint smell from earlier was just overbearing, so much so that it started seeping into my sense of taste. I covered my mouth with the bottom of my t-shirt, trying to shield myself from it, while I yelled out the muffled words, "Hello, ma'am? Do you need any help?" She paid no mind to me as she continued to make that weird grunting sound, and I was creeped out at this point, so I walked away a couple steps and turned to get a better look at her. She then decided to stand up, still with her back turned to me, and muttered the word muerte, which means death in Spanish. Confused, trying to understand what the strange woman had said to me, she then slowly turned to meet my gaze, and all the blood in my body pooled in my gut when I saw her face. It was extremely long, too long for a normal human body to be supporting it. The head of this thing almost resembled that of a horse or a donkey's head, and the eyes. I'll never forget the eyes, as much as I've tried to. They were gaping pits of blackness surrounded by a sea of red. complete silence fell over the area as I was petrified by what I was witnessing. My brain, a scrambling mess, was trying to make sense of the unnatural abomination that was before me. The creature then decided to let out what I can only describe as a high-pitched scream, like a cross between a pig squealing and a woman's wailing. My fight-or-flight reflex then kicked in, and I started sprinting to my house. I didn't even bother trying to unlock the gate to my fence. I jumped over it with ease. My grandmother saw when I came barging into the house. The words wouldn't even leave my mouth to tell her what I had seen, as the fatigue quickly kicked in after the adrenaline wore off. But afterwards, I described everything to her. With a look of urgency, she then decided to perform a cleansing ritual. The ritual involved rubbing an egg all across my body in 3 circular motions while chanting a special prayer. She then cracked the egg that she was using into a clear glass cup that was half filled with water, and when she did, the egg came out with streams of blood, and the yolk that came out of the egg looked similar to a human pupil, which is a very bad omen for the person who is being cleansed. After seeing this, she laid her hands on my forehead and chanted another prayer for about a minute, and threw the raw yolk out of our house and into the driveway. She didn't bother to say anything to me until the following morning, when she reluctantly told me that what I encountered was an entity that specifically preys on men, kind of like a succubus, and told me that this thing had a very dark and malicious intent, and that I was lucky to have gotten away from it. To this day, I haven't set foot on that stretch of road again. I live in a rural, but not isolated area in the Midwest. My window is right up against the forest, which is about 50 or 60 feet away from the tree line, about 20 or so feet above ground level. I heard what I am convinced was a low, echoing humming like a song from the woods. I've heard turkey, coyote, fox, deer, squirrel, and so on before, their cries, calls, and barks. This was none of those. As I laid there in bed, as I began to concentrate on the sound, I couldn't shake the mental conclusion of, it's a woman singing. The sound persisted for about 15 to 20 seconds and then stopped, but not suddenly. After a minute or 2 later, it picked back up again. This continued a few more times before it actually did stop completely. The sound was distant, not quite deep into the woods, but also not at the tree line. There's a small unit of deer that sometimes sleep in a clearing in the woods around that area, but they haven't been there in a few weeks. For some context, I am very much a late-night person. I used to work graveyard shifts due to my ability to stay alert so long into the night. This is how I know what all these common and uncommon woodland creatures sound like. And no, I did not look outside of my window. My process was this: if I can't identify it, don't look for it. I still think I was right to not seek out an immediate answer. Additionally, the song was clear. Let me start this off by saying that it is imperative that you stay off of the deep web. No matter what anyone tells you, no good can come from using it, and I am about to inform you as to why. I was 15 at the time. I had come home from school on a Friday afternoon ready to relax, kick back, and enjoy the short break. I had started using code about a year prior. Nothing too fancy, just basic Python, Java, HTTP, etc., and was practicing it daily. Now, I had known about the dark web before this took place. I would sometimes buy weed off of it, but that was about the extent. This particular day, however, I decided to venture further and really take a look at the dark web. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the iceberg diagram representing the internet's content. For those who don't know, the surface web contains about 10% of the internet's content, while the deep and dark web take up over 90%. I was ready to see what it really held. I heard stories about what goes down on the deep web, murder, inhumane torture, etc. But I didn't really believe that they were all legit. So I hopped on Tor and began to see what I could dig up. I started off by going on the hidden wiki and browsing through various websites, most of which contained illegal things such as drugs, hackers, and hitmen for hire, and lots of CP. I clicked on a random forum link, which took about a minute to load. I wish I could remember the name of it. It was a forum where people could pick a topic that they wanted to talk about, such as politics, dealing with mental health, etc. I noticed one of the topics was a pedo forum, and I don't want to even go into detail on what I saw there. There was one particular one that caught my eye. The link was all in red, while the rest were all black. It said, "Not for the weak, enter at your own risk." Curious as to what this was, I click on the link and it brought me to a forum that had only one other link on the whole page. I clicked that link and it brought me into a chat room. I realized that nobody was saying anything in it, only sending links. This set off alarm bells in my head because I had an idea of what was on those links. I wish that I had listened to my gut feeling, which was telling me to close out while you still can. However, the ignorant, curious teen took over me, and I started setting up some protection